celebrate the renewal of the land. We celebrate the renewal of the
The Pharaoh of Egypt stands before his court, draped in gold, worshipped as a living god. But tonight, he will enter his private chambers and engage in practices so shocking, so bizarre, so deeply disturbing that ancient historians struggled to write about them without blushing. Royal incest wasn't just accepted, it was required. Sacred fertility rituals involved public acts that would horrify us today, and the pursuit of pleasure, power, and divine legitimacy led pharaohs to behaviors that defy modern understanding. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we dive into one of the most scandalous chapters of ancient history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. This helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more fascinating stories from the past. Now, prepare yourself for a journey into the private lives of Egypt's god kings. What you're about to hear isn't fantasy or exaggeration. These are documented practices recorded by ancient scribes, carved on temple walls, and confirmed by modern archaeology. The sex lives of Egyptian pharaohs were stranger and more disturbing than anything Hollywood has ever portrayed. Let's begin. We start with perhaps the most shocking aspect of pharaonic sexuality, the practice of royal incest. But this wasn't just occasional or scandalous. This was required, expected, and considered sacred. Egyptian pharaohs didn't just marry their sisters. They married their daughters, their nieces, their aunts. The royal bloodline had to remain pure, and purity meant keeping everything in the family. Let me be very clear about what this meant in practice. Take Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC. He married his sister Nefertiti, who is famous today for her beautiful bust in museums. But Nefertiti wasn't his only wife. When she failed to produce a male heir, Akhenaten needed options, so he married his own daughters. Yes, his daughters. Ancient Egyptian records confirm that Akhenaten took at least 3 of his daughters as wives and had children with them. These weren't symbolic marriages. These were real, consummated marriages that produced children. The children born from these incestuous unions often had severe health problems. Modern analysis of royal mummies reveals genetic disorders, physical deformities, and shortened lifespans. King Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's son, is believed to have been the product of an incestuous relationship, possibly between Akhenaten and one of his sisters. Tutankhamun himself had a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and died at just 19 years old. His wife Ankhesenamun was his half-sister, and they had 2 daughters who were stillborn and mummified with their father. The genetic damage was catastrophic. But why? Why would the most powerful people in Egypt, with access to thousands of potential mates, choose to marry within their immediate family? The answer lies in Egyptian theology and their concept of divine kingship. Pharaohs weren't just rulers appointed by gods. They were gods themselves, specifically incarnations of the god Horus. And gods don't marry mortals. They marry other gods. The only people considered divine enough to marry a pharaoh were other members of the royal family who shared that divine blood. This belief was so strong that it overrode any concerns about genetic problems or moral taboos. In fact, the Egyptians looked at their most important gods and saw the same pattern. The god Osiris married his sister Isis. The god Set married his sister Nephthys. If the gods themselves engaged in sibling marriage, then how could pharaohs do any less? Royal incest wasn't a perversion of religious values. It was following divine example. The most extreme case might be Pharaoh Ramesses II, who we'll discuss more later, but who had over 200 wives and concubines. Many of these were his own daughters. Ancient texts refer to several of his daughters being elevated to the status of great royal wife, which was the highest position a woman could hold and required sharing the pharaoh's bed. Ramesses wasn't shy about this. He had monuments built depicting himself with his daughter wives. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was publicly celebrated. Modern historians estimate that in the New Kingdom period, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, at least half of all pharaohs married close relatives. Some dynasties showed genetic markers of sustained inbreeding over multiple generations. The famous Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled from 305 to 30 BC and included Cleopatra, practiced brother-sister marriage for nearly every generation. Cleopatra VII herself was married to two of her younger brothers at different points, though she had them killed when they became politically inconvenient. The genetic consequences were severe. Studies of royal mummies show high rates of bone disorders, dental problems, and other conditions associated with inbreeding. The royal line was literally degrading itself through this practice, becoming weaker with each generation. But theological necessity trumped biological reality. The pharaohs were gods, and gods married gods, regardless of what it did to their bodies or their children. Now let's talk about the sheer scale of pharaonic sexuality. A pharaoh didn't have one wife or even two. He had harems that numbered in the hundreds. But these weren't just for pleasure, though pleasure was certainly part of it. The royal harem was a complex political institution, a way to seal alliances, demonstrate power, and ensure plenty of heirs to the throne, and the sexual demands placed on pharaohs were immense. Consider Ramesses II, who we mentioned earlier, but who deserves deeper examination. Ramesses ruled for 66 years, from approximately 1279 to 1213 BC, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. During that time, he had over 200 wives and concubines documented in historical records. He fathered at least 96 sons and 60 daughters that we know of. That's 156 children minimum, and likely many more that weren't recorded. Do the math on this. If Ramesses became pharaoh at age 25 and ruled until he was 91, that's 66 years of reproductive activity. Fathering 156 children over 66 years means he was producing roughly 2.4 children per year every year for his entire reign. Given that pregnancy takes 9 months, this means he was constantly keeping multiple women pregnant simultaneously. He wasn't just maintaining a harem. He was running a baby factory. But it wasn't just about numbers. The political implications were enormous. Many of Rameses's wives were foreign princesses sent by their fathers as part of diplomatic treaties. Marrying a pharaoh's daughter or sister was how ancient kingdoms sealed alliances. When Rameses married a Hittite princess as part of the famous peace treaty ending the long wars between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, it wasn't just symbolic. The marriage had to be consummated. The princess had to become a real wife, sharing the pharaoh's bed and hopefully producing children who would unite both bloodlines. Inside the royal harem, which was essentially a palace within the palace, hundreds of women lived their entire lives. They weren't free to leave. They couldn't marry anyone else. Their entire existence was built around the possibility that the pharaoh might summon them to his bed. Some women might be called frequently if the pharaoh favored them. Others might go years without seeing him, growing old in gilded captivity, waiting for attention that never came. The hierarchy within the harem was brutal. At the top was the great royal wife, the pharaoh's principal spouse, usually his sister. She had enormous power and influence. Below her were secondary wives, ranked by their importance and the pharaoh's favor. At the bottom were concubines, women of lower status who served the pharaoh's pleasure but had little political power. Competition among these women was fierce and often deadly. Historical records document numerous harem conspiracies. The most famous is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III around 1155 BC. One of his minor wives, Taya, wanted her son to become pharaoh instead of the designated heir. So she organized a conspiracy within the harem, recruiting other wives, concubines, and even some palace officials. The plan was to assassinate Ramesses III and install Taya's son on the throne. The conspiracy was discovered, and the trials that followed revealed shocking details about life in the royal harem. Magic spells were created to harm the pharaoh. Wax figures were made and cursed. Palace servants were recruited. The conspiracy involved dozens of people, showing just how many individuals had access to the pharaoh's private spaces and how vulnerable even a god-king was within his own palace. Ramesses III may have died from the assassination attempt, though the records are unclear. What is clear is that everyone involved in the conspiracy was executed, often in horrific ways. Managing such a large harem required an entire bureaucracy. There were eunuchs who guarded the women and ensured no other men had access. There were scribes who recorded births, tracked bloodlines, and maintained the complex genealogies of the royal family. There were servants who attended to the women's needs, teachers who educated the royal children, and doctors who handled the constant pregnancies and births. The royal harem wasn't just a group of women. It was an institution employing hundreds of people, and the sexual expectations placed on the pharaoh were immense. He was expected to be constantly virile, always ready, eternally potent. This wasn't just personal. The pharaoh's sexual prowess was linked to Egypt's fertility. If the pharaoh was strong and virile, the Nile would flood properly, crops would grow, and Egypt would prosper. If the pharaoh was weak or impotent, disaster would follow. The entire kingdom's well-being was tied to one man's ability to perform sexually, which created enormous pressure. To help with this, ancient Egyptians developed what might be the world's first performance enhancement drugs, Medical papyri describe potions and treatments designed to increase male sexual stamina and desire. These included rather disturbing ingredients like ground-up animal genitals, certain plants with stimulant properties, and combinations that modern analysis suggests might have actually had some pharmaceutical effect, though they also likely had serious side effects. The pressure to perform extended beyond just the bedroom. Royal ceremonies included public displays that would shock modern sensibilities. During certain fertility festivals, the pharaoh was expected to demonstrate his virility in ways that were at least symbolically public. While we don't have complete records of what these ceremonies involved, references in texts and images on temple walls suggest that the pharaoh engaged in ritual acts meant to ensure the land's fertility. And these acts had sexual components that were witnessed or at least acknowledged by the court. Now we must discuss one of the most disturbing aspects of pharaonic sexuality, the practice of sacred marriage to gods, which involved real sexual acts performed as religious ritual. This isn't metaphor or symbolism. Egyptian religion included ceremonies where the pharaoh, or sometimes high-ranking priestesses, engaged in sexual activity as part of worship. The most documented example involves the god's wife of Amen, a position held by royal women. The god's wife of Amen was theoretically married to the god Amen, one of Egypt's most important deities. But this wasn't purely symbolic. The position came with enormous power and wealth, controlling vast temple estates and wielding political influence rivaling the pharaoh himself. And the role included sexual components that are uncomfortable to discuss but are documented in ancient texts. During certain religious festivals, the god's wife would perform rituals in the innermost shrine of Amen's temple. While we don't have explicit descriptions of everything that occurred, texts refer to the god visiting his wife, to unions that pleased the god, and to rituals ensuring cosmic fertility. Ancient Egyptian religion didn't separate the spiritual from the physical in the way modern religions do. Physical acts had spiritual significance, and spiritual unions required physical expression. Some historians believe these rituals involved the use of sacred objects, possibly phallic implements, representing the god's presence. Others think actual sexual acts occurred with priests acting as the god's representatives, though this is hotly debated. What's clear is that something physical happened during these ceremonies, something that the Egyptians understood as sacred marriage, and that this practice was considered essential to maintaining cosmic order. The position of God's wife of Amen became so powerful that during the Third Intermediate Period and Late Period, from roughly 1070 to 664 BC, these women effectively ruled southern Egypt. They never married mortal men and produced no children, instead adopting their successors. They were celibate except for their relationship with the god, which again raises questions about what that relationship actually involved. The power they wielded suggests their role was critically important to Egyptian religion and politics. Another disturbing practice involved the Min festival, celebrating the god Min, who was specifically the god of fertility and sexual potency, typically depicted with an erect phallus. The Min festival occurred annually and involve the pharaoh in central roles. Texts describe the pharaoh releasing birds and performing acts meant to demonstrate and ensure his continuing virility. Temple reliefs show the pharaoh making offerings to an ithyphallic statue of men, clearly emphasizing sexual themes. During the festival, there were processions, feasting, and rituals that celebrated human sexuality as a reflection of divine creative power. This wasn't considered obscene or shameful. Sex was sacred, a fundamental force of nature that made life possible. The pharaoh, as Egypt's supreme priest and divine king, had to engage with these forces both literally and symbolically. His sexuality wasn't private. It was a public concern tied to the nation's survival. Let me share something truly shocking now. We have ancient Egyptian erotica, not just subtle references or symbolic art, but explicit images and texts depicting sexual acts. The most famous is the Turin erotic papyrus, dating to around 1150 BC during the reign of Ramesses V. This papyrus contains 12 vignettes showing explicit sexual encounters between men and women in various positions. The drawings are cartoonish and humorous, suggesting this was entertainment, possibly for the royal court. What's significant is that this papyrus was found in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, where the craftsmen who built the royal tombs lived. It wasn't hidden or secret. It was just part of their cultural materials. The Egyptians weren't prudish about sex. They saw it as natural, enjoyable, and worthy of celebration and even humor. The explicit nature of the papyrus shows that Egyptians depicted sexuality openly in ways that would be censored in many modern contexts. But royal sexuality wasn't just about pleasure or even about producing heirs. It was about demonstrating divine power. When a pharaoh took a new wife, especially a foreign princess, the act of consummating that marriage was a demonstration of Egypt's dominance over that princess's homeland. When he fathered children on multiple women simultaneously, he was showing that Egypt's divine favor was so strong that his seed never failed. Every sexual act by the pharaoh had political and religious implications. This brings us to Cleopatra VII, perhaps the most famous Egyptian ruler. Though technically she was Greek, part of the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. Cleopatra's sex life has been the subject of endless speculation, much of it influenced by Roman propaganda that portrayed her as an exotic seductress who corrupted noble Roman men. But what do we actually know? Cleopatra had 4 children by 2 different fathers, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her relationship with Caesar began when she was 21 and he was 52. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet or bedding, appearing before him unexpectedly. Whether they became lovers immediately or whether the relationship developed over time, we don't know for certain. What we do know is that she bore him a son, Caesarion, and that Caesar acknowledged the child, a politically explosive act that contributed to his assassination. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra allied herself with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful generals. Their relationship produced 3 children and ultimately led to war with Rome. Roman propaganda portrayed Cleopatra as a scheming seductress who used sex to manipulate and control Roman leaders. But this simplistic narrative ignores Cleopatra's considerable intelligence, political skill, and the genuine partnerships she formed with both Caesar and Antony. Cleopatra was also married, remember, to her younger brothers Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV, as required by the incestuous marriage practices of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She had both of them killed when they became obstacles to her power. Her sexuality wasn't just personal. It was a tool of statecraft, used to forge alliances, produce heirs, and maintain her position as Egypt's ruler in a world dominated by aggressive Roman expansion. The Romans were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by Cleopatra. Roman sexual mores were quite different from Egyptian ones. While Roman men had considerable sexual freedom, women were expected to be chaste and modest. Cleopatra, who took lovers openly, who divorced and married as political necessity dictated, who bore children to foreign rulers, violated every Roman expectation of proper female behavior. The propaganda against her emphasized her sexuality because it was the easiest way to delegitimize her power. Let me now address a darker aspect of pharaonic sexuality that's rarely discussed: sexual violence and abuse. The pharaoh's absolute power meant that his desires were law. If he wanted a particular woman, there was no refusing him. We have records of pharaohs seeing someone's wife or daughter and simply taking her into the royal harem. The husband or father couldn't object without risking execution. Lower-ranking women in the palace, servants and slaves, were even more vulnerable. They had no rights and no recourse. If a pharaoh or a prince desired them, they had no choice but to comply. While we don't have many explicit accounts of this, the power dynamics make it clear that consent, as we understand it today, wasn't really possible. When one person is considered a living god and the other is a servant or slave, any sexual relationship is inherently coercive. The children born from these encounters had ambiguous status. If the mother was a concubine of higher status, her children might be recognized as royal and placed in the line of succession. If the mother was a slave, her children might be slaves themselves, or they might be freed and given positions in the palace, or they might be acknowledged as royal offspring of lower rank. It depended entirely on the pharaoh's whim. There is also evidence of sexual violence as punishment or humiliation. Defeated enemies, especially female royalty from conquered kingdoms, might be taken into the pharaoh's harem not as honored wives, but essentially as captives. Being forced to bear the conqueror's children was itself a form of dominance, a way of demonstrating that their former kingdom's royal bloodline was now contaminated and subservient to Egypt. Now let's discuss something that might seem contradictory. Egyptian sexual ethics did exist, at least for non-royal people. Adultery was considered a serious crime. Rape was punishable by death or mutilation. Marriage was valued, and couples were expected to be faithful to each other. But these rules applied to ordinary Egyptians. The pharaoh was above such laws. Divine kings didn't follow mortal ethics. What would be adultery for a common man was royal prerogative for a pharaoh. This created a two-tiered system where behavior that was criminal for regular citizens was expected and celebrated for royalty. A commoner who married his sister would be violating social norms and possibly religious law. A pharaoh who married his sister was fulfilling divine mandate. A common man who kept hundreds of women would be considered a monster. A pharaoh doing the same was demonstrating proper divine authority. The medical papyri of ancient Egypt include treatments for various sexual health issues, suggesting that Egyptians were practical and open about sexual matters. There are treatments for impotence, for preventing pregnancy, and for enhancing pleasure. Some of these remedies sound bizarre to modern ears. For example, one contraceptive method involved inserting a mixture of honey and crocodile dung into the vagina. Whether this actually prevented pregnancy is doubtful, though the acidic nature of the mixture might have had some spermicidal effect. Other medical texts discuss treatments for sexually transmitted infections, though they wouldn't have understood disease transmission as we do. Descriptions of symptoms and treatments suggest that STIs were present in ancient Egypt, which makes sense given the sexual practices we've been discussing, with pharaohs having hundreds of sexual partners over their lifetimes, and those partners potentially having relations with others before or after the pharaoh. Disease transmission would have been inevitable. Let's talk about royal favorites and the power that came from being sexually desired by the pharaoh. A woman who caught the pharaoh's attention could rise from obscurity to wielding enormous influence. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's chief wife, wielded power rivaling any pharaoh. She appeared in royal art as often as Akhenaten himself, sometimes depicted smiting enemies, a role usually reserved for the pharaoh alone. Some scholars even suggest she may have ruled as pharaoh herself for a brief period after Akhenaten's death. How did Nefertiti gain such power? Part of it was certainly her intelligence and political skill, but the foundation of her power was her position as Akhenaten's beloved wife. She maintained his affection for decades, which in the competitive environment of the royal harem was an extraordinary achievement. Other wives might bear children, but Nefertiti kept Akhenaten's attention and translated that into political power. Compare this to Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten. Tiye came from a non-royal family, which was unusual for a great royal wife, but she captured Amenhotep III's devotion and became one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. She was involved in diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers, acted as advisor to her husband and later her son, and was depicted in art with a size and prominence usually reserved for pharaohs themselves. What did these women do to maintain their positions? Beyond personal charm and political intelligence, they had to continually satisfy the pharaoh's desires while fending off competitors from the harem. They had to bear children, hopefully sons, while managing the complex relationships with other wives and their children. They had to navigate court politics, priestly factions, and foreign relations. And they had to do all this while technically being property with no independent legal standing. Their power was always derivative, dependent on male favor. let me share something about royal childhood that's relevant to understanding pharaonic sexuality. Royal children were raised with an understanding that their bodies and their sexuality were political tools. Princesses knew from a young age that they might be married to their father, their brother, their uncle, or sent as diplomatic gifts to foreign kings. Princes knew they would have multiple wives and that producing heirs was a sacred duty. The concept of romantic love as the basis for marriage was foreign to them. Marriage was about power, alliances, and maintaining the divine bloodline. This doesn't mean Egyptian royal couples never loved each other. Some clearly did. The famous love poetry from ancient Egypt, some of the oldest love poems in human history, show that Egyptians understood and valued romantic love. But for royalty, love was a bonus, not a requirement. You married for political reasons. If affection developed, wonderful. If not, you did your duty anyway. Young pharaohs were introduced to sex early by modern standards. A prince who would become pharaoh needed to understand his reproductive duties. There are references in texts to princes being taught by experienced women, sometimes older wives of the previous pharaoh, sometimes professional courtesans. By the time a boy became pharaoh, often in his early teens, he was expected to be sexually active and capable of performing his dynastic obligations. The pressure on royal women was equally intense, but different. A princess's virginity was valuable if she was being married off as a diplomatic gift. But if she was staying within the royal family, becoming her father's or brother's wife, different rules applied. The earlier she began producing children, the better, from a dynastic perspective. Girls could be married and bearing children by their mid-teens, which was normal for the ancient world but horrifying by modern standards. Now, let's discuss one of the strangest aspects of pharaonic sexuality. The religious ritual called the Sed Festival. This was a jubilee celebration typically held after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years, meant to renew his power and prove his continued fitness to rule. The festival included numerous rituals, and some of these had sexual components that are frankly bizarre. One ritual involved the pharaoh running a course to demonstrate his physical vigor. He would race around a set path, symbolically claiming Egypt's territory. But other rituals were more explicitly sexual. There are references to the pharaoh mounting various symbols, to rituals involving the god Men that we discussed earlier, and to acts meant to demonstrate and renew the pharaoh's fertility. The exact nature of these acts is debated, but they clearly had sexual dimensions that were considered religiously necessary. Some scholars interpret certain hieroglyphic texts and temple reliefs as depicting the pharaoh engaging in ritual masturbation as an offering to the gods. This might sound absurd or offensive to modern ears, but in Egyptian cosmology, the god Atum created the universe through an act of self-pleasure, bringing forth the first gods from his own body. For the pharaoh to replicate this act during religious ceremonies would be following divine precedent and participating in the creative forces of the universe. These rituals weren't considered obscene or shameful. They were sacred acts, participation in divine mysteries that maintained cosmic order. The pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler. He was Egypt's chief priest, responsible for performing rituals that kept the universe functioning properly. If those rituals required sexual acts, then those acts were holy obligations, not personal indulgences. Let me address something that's often romanticized in popular culture: royal bathing and the elaborate beauty rituals of Egyptian royalty. While these ceremonies were certainly about cleanliness and appearance, they also had sexual dimensions. The pharaoh's bath would be attended by numerous servants, often including women from the harem. These bathing sessions could include massage with scented oils, grooming, and activities that went beyond simple hygiene. The women who attended the pharaoh during his bath had intimate access to his body. They would wash him, oil his skin, perfume him, and dress him. These moments of physical closeness were opportunities for favorites to maintain their position or for ambitious women to catch the pharaoh's attention. A woman who performed these services particularly well, who pleased the pharaoh during his bath, might be summoned to his bedchamber later. Cleopatra's famous entrance to meet Julius Caesar, rolled in a carpet, mirrors another famous story about her meeting Mark Antony. She sailed up the Cydnus River to meet him on a barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and graces. The entire presentation was theatrical, designed to overwhelm and seduce through spectacle. Cleopatra understood that royal sexuality was performative, that presentation and ritual mattered as much as the acts themselves. Speaking of Cleopatra, let's address the Roman propaganda that portrayed her as sexually insatiable and deviant. Roman writers described her as having invented sex acts, as being so skilled in pleasure that Roman men were helpless before her wiles. These accounts tell us more about Roman anxieties than about Cleopatra herself. Rome was expanding rapidly, absorbing foreign cultures, and Romans were worried about being corrupted by Eastern decadence. Cleopatra became a symbol of all those fears. The reality was that Cleopatra had two long-term relationships with Caesar and Antony and 4 children. By the standards of Egyptian royalty, her sex life was relatively modest. But because she was a woman wielding power in a man's world, because she was foreign, because she challenged Roman dominance, she had to be portrayed as sexually excessive and corrupt. Her sexuality was weaponized against her, turned into a political liability by her enemies. After Cleopatra's defeat and death in 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province, and the age of the pharaohs ended. The sexual practices we've discussed, the royal incest, the massive harems, the sacred marriage rituals, all of this faded into history. Roman and later Christian morality viewed these practices as examples of pagan excess and corruption. The god kings were reinterpreted as tyrants, their harems as evidence of depravity rather than divine prerogative. But we need to understand these practices in their proper context. The Egyptians weren't trying to be shocking or perverse. They were following what they believed was divine mandate. The pharaoh was a god, and gods behaved according to divine logic, not human morality. What seems bizarre or wrong to us made perfect sense within Egyptian cosmology and theology. This doesn't mean we should excuse practices that we now recognize as harmful. The genetic damage from sustained inbreeding was real. The power imbalances that made genuine consent impossible were real. The exploitation of lower status women was real. We can understand historical context while also acknowledging that some practices were harmful to the people who lived through them. The legacy of pharaonic sexuality lives on in unexpected ways. When we talk about keeping it in the family or royal blood, we're echoing Egyptian concepts. When we refer to rulers as being above normal laws, we're reflecting the idea that different standards apply to those in power. And when we're fascinated by the sex lives of the rich and powerful, we're continuing an ancient tradition of interest in how rulers behave behind closed doors. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies continues to reveal new information about pharaonic genealogies and reproductive practices. We've confirmed that yes, the incest was real and sustained over many generations. We've identified genetic disorders consistent with inbreeding. We've traced bloodlines and paternity with scientific precision that would have been impossible just decades ago. Every new discovery adds to our understanding of how these god kings really lived and loved and reproduced. The archaeological record also keeps surprising us. New tomb discoveries occasionally include erotic art or objects with sexual purposes. Temple inscriptions provide new context for religious practices, and medical papyri, when fully translated and understood, offer insights into how Egyptians thought about sexuality, reproduction, and pleasure. The ancient Egyptians left us an extensive record, and we're still learning to read it properly. One final thought about pharaonic sexuality. For all their power, for all their divinity, for all their elaborate rituals and massive harems, the pharaohs were still human. They desired pleasure, affection, and love just like anyone else. Some clearly loved their spouses. Some wrote poetry expressing genuine emotion. Some mourned deeply when partners died. Behind all the political maneuvering and religious ritual and dynastic necessity, there were real people with real feelings. That humanity makes their practices both more understandable and more troubling. They weren't aliens or monsters. They were people shaped by their culture, following the rules and expectations of their time, trying to fulfill impossible divine roles while remaining mortal. The tragedy is that the roles they were forced into, the expectations placed upon them, often made genuine human connection difficult or impossible. How do you have a real relationship when you're worshipped as a god? How do you experience true intimacy when every interaction is shadowed by vast power imbalances? These questions don't have easy answers. The sex lives of Egyptian pharaohs remain shocking, fascinating, and disturbing in equal measure. They reveal a civilization that was sophisticated, complex, and deeply alien to our modern sensibilities. They remind us that human societies can organize sexuality in radically different ways, that what we consider natural or moral is culturally constructed, and they provide endless fascination for anyone interested in how power, religion, and desire intersect in the most extreme circumstances. The pharaohs are long dead. Their kingdoms, their pyramids and temples crumble slowly under the desert sun, but their stories survive, carved in stone, written on papyrus, preserved in mummy wrappings and tomb paintings. And those stories continue to shock us, millennia later, because they reveal truths about human nature that remain relevant regardless of how much time has passed. Guys, now we move to our next story. This one's about something everyone thinks they know about from movies and TV shows and wild imaginations. Roman orgies. The word itself conjures images. Rooms full of naked Romans draped over couches, grapes being fed by beautiful servants, wine flowing freely, and everyone engaging in every form of debauchery imaginable. It's become shorthand for excess, for the decadence that supposedly brought down the greatest empire in history. But here's the thing. Almost everything you think you know about Roman orgies is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. The reality was stranger, more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more disturbing than the Hollywood version. So let's go back to Rome in 56 AD, to the home of Gaius Petronius, a wealthy senator, and experience what a real Roman evening entertainment actually looked like. Your Marcus Flavius, a young equestrian, basically upper middle class in Roman terms. You're 28, educated, financially comfortable, and you've just received an invitation to a dinner party at Petronius's villa. This is a big deal. Petronius is well-connected, wealthy, and his parties are talked about across Rome. An invitation means you're being considered for his social circle, which could open doors politically and financially. The invitation specifies the 9th hour, which is mid-afternoon, by our reckoning, around 3 p.m. Roman dinner parties, called convivia, start in the afternoon and can last well into the night. You bathe first at the public baths, getting yourself clean and properly groomed. Romans take bathing seriously, spending hours at the baths, socializing, exercising, and preparing themselves. You're scrubbed, oiled, and dressed in your best toga by the time you arrive at Petronius's villa in the fashionable Esquiline district. The villa is impressive, as you expected. A large atrium leads to a peristyle garden, and beyond that, the triclinium, the dining room. This is where the party will happen, and it's been decorated elaborately for the occasion. Couches are arranged around the walls in a U shape, each couch designed to hold 3 people reclining on their left sides. This is how Romans eat at formal dinners. Lying down, propped on one elbow, leaving the right hand free for eating. There are 9 couches, meaning space for 27 guests. Though Petronius has invited only about 20 people, this is deliberate. Romans believe the ideal dinner party has between 9 and 27 guests, enough for good conversation, but not so many that it becomes chaotic. Everyone invited is male, all citizens of good standing, a mix of senators, equestrians, and a few poets and philosophers for entertainment value. You're greeted by Petronius himself, a man of about 50 with a carefully cultivated air of sophisticated boredom. He's wearing an expensive synthesis, a kind of dinner outfit that's more comfortable than a toga. Marcus Flavius, welcome. I've heard good things about your business ventures in Ostia. Come take a couch. We'll be starting soon. Because now we move to our next story. This one's about something everyone thinks they know about from movies and TV shows and wild imaginations. Roman orgies. The word itself conjures images. Rooms full of naked Romans draped over couches, grapes being fed by beautiful servants, wine flowing freely, and everyone engaging in every form of debauchery imaginable. It's become shorthand for excess, for the decadence that supposedly brought down the greatest empire in history. But here's the thing. Almost everything you think you know about Roman orgies is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. The reality was stranger, more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more disturbing than the Hollywood version. So let's go back to Rome in 56 AD, to the home of Gaius Petronius, a wealthy senator, and experience what a real Roman evening entertainment actually looked like. You're Marcus Flavius, a young equestrian, basically upper middle class in Roman terms. You're 28, educated, financially comfortable, and you've just received an invitation to a dinner party at Petronius's villa. This is a big deal. Petronius is well-connected, wealthy, and his parties are talked about across Rome. An invitation means you're being considered for his social circle, which could open doors politically and financially. The invitation specifies the 9th hour, which is mid-afternoon, by our reckoning, around 3 p.m. Roman dinner parties, called convivia, start in the afternoon and can last well into the night. You bathe first at the public baths, getting yourself clean and properly groomed. Romans take bathing seriously, spending hours at the baths, socializing, exercising, and preparing themselves. You're scrubbed, oiled, and dressed in your best toga by the time you arrive at Petronius's villa in the fashionable Esquiline district. The villa is impressive, as you expected. A large atrium leads to a peristyle garden, and beyond that, the triclinium, the dining room. This is where the party will happen, and it's been decorated elaborately for the occasion. Couches are arranged around the walls in a U shape, each couch designed to hold 3 people reclining on their left sides. This is how Romans eat at formal dinners. Lying down, propped on one elbow, leaving the right hand free for eating. There are 9 couches, meaning space for 27 guests. Though Petronius has invited only about 20 people, this is deliberate. Romans believe the ideal dinner party has between 9 and 27 guests, enough for good conversation, but not so many that it becomes chaotic. Everyone invited is male, all citizens of good standing, a mix of senators, equestrians, and a few poets and philosophers for entertainment value. You're greeted by Petronius himself, a man of about 50 with a carefully cultivated air of sophisticated boredom. He's wearing an expensive synthesis, a kind of dinner outfit that's more comfortable than a toga. Marcus Flavius, welcome. I've heard good things about your business ventures in Ostia. Come take a couch. We'll be starting soon. Lydia, the courtesan beside you, participates in these conversations intelligently. This surprises you, though it shouldn't. High-class courtesans in Rome are educated, trained in music, literature, and conversation. They're entertainers in the fullest sense, not just sexual partners. She quotes Sappho, debates Epicurus, makes witty observations that have the room laughing. The second course arrives. Fish, chicken, pork, vegetables, more elaborate than the first course, but still reasonable. You eat, you talk, you drink. The atmosphere is relaxed, sophisticated, enjoyable. This is what wealthy Romans do for entertainment. They recline with friends and courtesans, eat good food, drink good wine, and engage in elevated conversation. But as the evening progresses and more wine flows, the atmosphere shifts. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. The conversations become more personal, more intimate. Physical contact increases. Lydia's hand rests on your arm when she talks. Other courtesans are similarly positioned with other guests, creating paired intimacy within the group setting. Then Petronius makes an announcement. For those interested, the private rooms are available. For those who prefer to remain, we'll continue with the third course and more entertainment. This is the moment of choice, and it's handled with remarkable discretion. No pressure, no expectations, just an option presented casually. About half the guests, including some of the courtesans, choose to remain in the triclinium. The dinner continues for them, becoming more relaxed, more informal, but still fundamentally a dinner party. The other half, including you and Lydia, excuse themselves and move to private chambers off the peristyle garden. This is where the sexual activity happens, but here's what's crucial. It's private, paired off, and consensual. You and Lydia go to a small, well-appointed bedroom. What happens there is between you and her, negotiated, agreed upon, compensated appropriately since she's a professional. It's not particularly exotic, not especially depraved. It's a business transaction wrapped in social sophistication, a common arrangement between wealthy Roman men and courtesans. Meanwhile, in the triclinium, the party continues. The third course arrives: desserts, fruits, nuts, honey cakes. The wine flows more freely now, and the conversation becomes looser, more philosophical, occasionally bawdy. Someone recites poetry, probably a bit obscene. Someone else tells stories about campaigns in Germania or adventures in Egypt. Laughter fills the room, the easy laughter of people comfortable with each other and pleasantly drunk. Later, you and Lydia rejoin the main party. Nobody comments. Nobody makes a fuss. It's treated as normal, which it is for this social class. Other couples drift back as well, returning to couches, picking up conversations, having more wine. The party continues into the night, gradually winding down as guests become tired, drunk, or simply satisfied. By midnight, people start leaving. Slaves are summoned with torches to light the way home through Rome's dark streets. Goodbyes are said. Thanks are offered to Petronius for his hospitality. You leave with several other guests, walking through the quiet city, discussing the evening, making plans to meet again. This was a Roman convivium, what gets called an orgy in popular imagination. But what actually happened? You ate good food, drank good wine, had intelligent conversations, and optionally engaged in private, consensual sexual activity with a courtesan. That's it. No massive group sex, no depraved rituals, no incredible excess. Just wealthy people entertaining themselves in ways that mix social, intellectual, and sexual pleasure. Now you might be thinking, that's it? That's what all the fuss is about? And the answer is yes, mostly. But we need to dig deeper, understand the context, and explore why these parties gain such a scandalous reputation, because there's more to the story. First, let's talk about what these parties were called. Romans didn't call them orgies. That word comes from the Greek orgia, which referred to secret religious rites, often associated with Dionysus or Bacchus, involving ecstatic worship, dancing, and possibly sexual activity. These were religious ceremonies, not dinner parties. What Romans called their dinner parties were convivia, symposia, or sometimes commissationes when they became particularly drunken. The word convivium just means a living together, a gathering. It was their normal word for any dinner party, sexual or not. Most convivia had no sexual component at all. They were just social gatherings. The parties that did include sexual activity were usually called commissationes, which has connotations of drunken revelry, or they might be described as parties in the Greek manner, referring to the symposium tradition where courtesans called heterae would attend and entertain guests. But even these had structure, rules, and social conventions governing them. The reality is that Roman upper-class social life often blurred the lines between dinner party, intellectual salon, and sexual encounter, but it did so within fairly strict social rules. Certain behaviors were acceptable, others weren't. Certain people could be present, others couldn't. Everything happened within a framework of status, class, and social performance. For example, respectable women, meaning the wives and daughters of citizens, never attended these parties. Never. To do so would destroy their reputation and their family's honor. The women present were courtesans, slaves, or freed women, people outside the respectable social hierarchy. This was crucial to Roman morality. Sexual activity with courtesans was fine, normal, accepted. Sexual activity involving respectable women was scandalous, potentially criminal. Similarly, what happened at these parties had to be relatively private. Public sexual activity, in the literal sense of doing it in front of others, was considered degrading, shameful. Even at parties where sexual activity happened, it occurred in private rooms, between individuals, or small groups. The massive group sex scenes from movies simply didn't happen. Or if they did, they were so scandalous that they'd be mentioned in historical sources as shocking aberrations. The sources we have that describe actual Roman parties are quite consistent about this. Petronius's Satyricon, written in the 1st century AD, describes wealthy Roman parties in satirical detail. There's food, wine, entertainment, some sexual activity, but it's always presented as happening in relative privacy between specific individuals. The wild public group sex that people imagine simply isn't there. Juvenal's satires, also 1st century AD, condemn Roman moral decay and describe various sexual behaviors. But again, what he describes is more subtle than the popular imagination suggests. He talks about married women sneaking to parties they shouldn't attend, about wealthy men keeping multiple mistresses, about bathhouses where sexual encounters happened. But it's individual behavior, not massive group orgies. Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, written in the early 2nd century AD, describes the excesses of various emperors. This is where things get more extreme, but it's important to understand that what he describes is precisely shocking because it's exceptional. Normal Roman parties weren't like this. For example, Suetonius describes Tiberius's parties on Capri as featuring groups of prostitutes and young men performing sexual acts while Tiberius watched. This is presented as shocking, perverse evidence of Tiberius's moral corruption. If this was normal behavior at Roman parties, it wouldn't be shocking or worth mentioning. He describes Caligula as attending his own sister's wedding and then taking her away to his bedroom, which is presented as an almost unbelievable violation of all social norms. He describes Nero forcing noble women to perform in theatrical productions, which was degrading because respectable women weren't supposed to be on stage, and these productions apparently had sexual components. But notice, these are emperors behaving badly, and even their bad behavior is usually described as happening in private settings or in ways that shocked their contemporaries. These aren't descriptions of normal Roman social life. They're accusations of moral monstrosity directed at specific individuals. The truth is that everyday Roman sexual morality was complicated, and understanding it requires getting past modern assumptions about sex, morality, and privacy. Romans didn't think about sex the way we do. They didn't have our concepts of sexual orientation, for example. A Roman man might have sexual relationships with women and men, and nobody would think that made him bisexual. Sexual categories didn't work that way. What mattered to Romans was status and role. A Roman citizen man could have sex with anyone of lower status: slaves, prostitutes, non-citizens. This was normal, acceptable, expected even. What he couldn't do without social consequences was be the penetrated partner in a sexual encounter with another man, because that was considered submissive, degrading, unmanly. Being the active partner was fine. Being passive was shameful. This is why Roman sources constantly insult their enemies by accusing them of being sexually passive. It's not homophobic in the modern sense because they're not objecting to male-male sex. They're objecting to a citizen man taking what they saw as a submissive feminine role. The objection is about status and gender performance, not sexual orientation. Similarly, Roman men having sex with their slaves, male or female, was completely normal and uncontroversial. Slaves were property. Using them sexually was no different morally than using them for any other purpose. This is disturbing from a modern perspective, but it's crucial to understanding Roman sexual culture. Consent didn't matter when it came to slaves because slaves weren't free persons capable of giving or withholding consent in Roman legal and moral terms. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and common. There were brothels throughout Rome, easily identifiable by signs and symbols. Courtesans ranged from cheap streetwalkers to extremely expensive companions who entertained only the wealthy. Using prostitutes wasn't shameful for Roman men. It was normal. What would be shameful was being a prostitute, but that shame didn't extend to the men who paid them. So when wealthy Romans had parties that included courtesans, they weren't doing anything unusual or particularly immoral by their own standards. They were just combining entertainment activities, good food, good wine, good conversation, and sex with courtesans. The fact that this happened in a semi-public setting, at a party with other people present, didn't make it an orgy in the sense we imagine. It was just efficient use of social time. What about the famous Bacchanalia, the Roman festivals in honor of Bacchus that were supposedly so debauched that the Senate banned them in 186 BC? These are often cited as evidence of Roman orgiastic excess. But when you read the actual historical accounts, the reality is more complicated. The Bacchanalia were secret religious rites, mystery cults that had been imported from Greece. They involved nighttime ceremonies, dancing, ecstatic worship, and possibly sexual activity. But the Senate didn't ban them because they were sexual. They banned them because they were secret, because they involved oaths of loyalty to the cult rather than to Rome, because they were seen as politically subversive. The sexual component, to the extent it existed, was part of the religious ecstasy, not the main purpose. And even then, the descriptions we have are from Roman senators trying to justify the ban, so they're exaggerated, sensationalized, made to sound as shocking as possible. We don't actually know what happened at Bacchanalia ceremonies because they were secret, and most sources are hostile. What we do know is that various religious cults in the Roman world had ecstatic components, ritual practices that put participants in altered states through dancing, chanting, possibly drugs or alcohol. Some of these states had sexual elements, but calling them orgies, equating them with dinner parties where rich people had sex with courtesans, is mixing up completely different things. The Roman sexual landscape also included bathhouses, which were major social centers. Romans bathed in gender-segregated public baths, spending hours there exercising, socializing, conducting business. The baths were also places where sexual encounters could happen, particularly between men, though this was technically illegal if it involved citizens. We have evidence of bathhouses being used for prostitution, male and female. We have evidence of sexual graffiti in bathhouses. We have sources that talk about sexual encounters at baths. But again, this wasn't public in the sense of happening in front of crowds. It happened in private areas, massage rooms, back areas, where such activities could be conducted discreetly. The one place where public sexual activity actually occurred in Rome was in theatrical performances. Roman theater included mime shows that were often very sexually explicit, with performers simulating or possibly even actually engaging in sexual acts on stage. These performances were considered lowbrow entertainment, not something respectable people would admit to enjoying, though many probably did. But this is theater, professional entertainment, not people at a party having sex with each other. It's more like a strip show or adult entertainment venue than an orgy. The performers are putting on a show. The audience is watching. It's fundamentally different from the participatory group sex that the word orgy implies. So where does the modern image of Roman orgies come from? Why do we have this idea of rooms full of Romans engaging in massive group sex, complete with every imaginable form of debauchery? Part of it comes from Christian writers in late antiquity. As Christianity gained power in the Roman Empire, Christian authors wrote extensively about pagan Roman moral corruption, often exaggerating or inventing details to make paganism look as bad as possible. These writings emphasized sexual excess, perversion, and degeneracy as characteristics of pagan Rome. These accounts became extremely influential in how later generations understood Roman history. Medieval Christians read these texts and saw them as factual descriptions of how pagans behaved. This reinforced Christian morality by showing how terrible life was. But these texts were propaganda, not objective history. The Renaissance and Enlightenment brought renewed interest in classical Rome, but often approached it through the lens of these Christian sources. Artists and writers imagined Roman decadence, creating artwork and literature that depicted the orgies described by Christian moralists. These artistic representations, more than actual Roman sources, shaped the popular image. Then Hollywood got involved. Movies from the 1950s and 60s like Quo Vadis, Spartacus, and the fall of the Roman Empire depicted Rome as a place of incredible excess, with decadent parties featuring scantily clad dancers, overflowing food, and implied sexual activity. These movies were constrained by censorship, so they couldn't show actual sex, but they implied it heavily. Later films, especially after censorship relaxed, became more explicit. Movies like Caligula, Satyricon, and various exploitation films showed Rome as a place of constant sexual excess, with orgies a regular occurrence. These films were entertaining, but they were fantasy, not history. Television continued the trend. HBO's Rome showed plenty of sexual content, usually at parties. Spartacus was even more explicit. These shows did better historical research than older films, but they still emphasized sexual content for drama and audience appeal. The result is that multiple generations have been raised on images of Roman orgies that are more Hollywood than history. So what were actual Roman sexual attitudes? Complex. Romans valued self-control, which they called temperantia. Excessive desire for sex, food, wine, or anything else was considered a weakness. The ideal Roman man was temperate, controlled, moderate in his pleasures. But moderate didn't mean absent. Romans enjoyed pleasure, including sexual pleasure, but believed it should be pursued in controlled, appropriate ways. Status was everything. A citizen man could have sex with anyone of lower status without moral judgment. A citizen woman couldn't have sex with anyone except her husband without destroying her reputation. Slaves had no sexual autonomy at all. The rules were about maintaining social hierarchy, not about sex itself. Privacy mattered. Public displays of sexuality were considered degrading. Even emperors who were known for sexual excess usually conducted that excess in private settings. What happened behind closed doors was your business. What happened in public spaces was everyone's business and subject to moral judgment. Marriage was about property, family alliances, and producing legitimate children. Love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't the purpose of marriage. Sex within marriage was for procreation. pleasure could be found elsewhere, with courtesans or slaves, and this wasn't considered infidelity in the way we understand it. As long as a man didn't compromise his wife's reputation or claim anyone else's children as his legitimate heirs, he could do what he wanted. These attitudes produced the party culture we've been discussing. Wealthy Roman men could gather with their peers, invite courtesans, have private sexual encounters, and nobody considered it immoral as long as social rules were followed. It wasn't an orgy. It was just Tuesday night for rich Romans. The closest thing Rome had to what we'd call orgies were probably some of the bacchanalian rituals, mystery cult ceremonies, or emperors' private parties. But even these, when you read the actual sources, aren't quite what we imagine. They're more controlled, more structured, more bound by social conventions than the popular image suggests. The truth is that most Romans, most of the time, had fairly conventional sexual lives. They married, had children, and conducted their affairs within accepted social boundaries. The wild stories we hear are either about emperors who lived by different rules, or their exaggerations by hostile sources trying to make someone look bad. Even the emperors, whose excesses are well documented, weren't having massive group orgies every night. They were having private parties with prostitutes and slaves, which was normal behavior scaled up through imperial resources. Tiberius on Capri, Caligula in Rome, Nero with his freedman companions, they were doing what wealthy Romans did, just with more money and power and fewer checks on their behavior. The lasting image of Roman orgies tells us more about later societies than about Rome itself. It tells us about Christian anxiety about pagan sexuality. It tells us about Renaissance fascination with classical decadence. It tells us about Victorian simultaneous disgust and fascination with sex. It tells us about Hollywood's need for spectacle and sensationalism. What it doesn't tell us is what actually happened at Roman dinner parties. Those were sophisticated social events where wealthy people ate, drank, talked, and sometimes had private sexual encounters with courtesans. They were about status display, social networking, intellectual engagement, and pleasure, in that order. Sex was part of it, but not the main point, and certainly not the public free-for-all we've been led to believe. So the next time someone mentions Roman orgies, you can tell them the truth. They didn't exist, not in the way we imagine. What existed were convivia, dinner parties, social gatherings where pleasure was pursued in controlled, status-conscious ways. Not as exciting as the movies, perhaps, but far more interesting when you understand the actual social dynamics at play. The Romans were complex, contradictory, familiar, and alien at the same time. They valued both pleasure and self-control, both social hierarchy and social pleasure, both privacy and community. Their sexual culture reflected these tensions, creating practices that seem strange to us but made perfect sense in their context. Understanding this helps us understand not just Rome but ourselves. We've been telling stories about Roman orgies for 2,000 years, each generation reshaping those stories to reflect their own anxieties and desires. The Romans we imagine tell us who we are, what we fear, what we want. The real Romans, the ones who ate and drank and talked and loved and died in that ancient city, they're more subtle, more interesting, and more human than any movie could capture. And maybe that's the real lesson. History isn't about confirming our preconceptions or feeding our fantasies. It's about understanding people who lived differently than us, thought differently than us, but were ultimately just as human as we are. The Romans had sex, they had parties, they had fun, but they did it their way, according to their rules, in their context. And that's endlessly more fascinating than any orgy scene Hollywood could produce. We move now to our third story, stepping into the shadows of ancient Rome where respectability ended and commerce of a different kind flourished. Tonight, we're exploring what actually happened inside a Roman lupanar, the official brothels that dotted every major city in the empire, where painted walls advertised services, stone beds supported brief encounters, and business transactions happened with remarkable efficiency and surprising regulation in civilization that treated sex work as mundane commercial activity rather than moral catastrophe. The lupanar of Pompeii, preserved by Vesuvius's eruption in 79 CE, provides our most detailed evidence about how these establishments actually functioned. The two-story building near the Forum, containing 10 small rooms, each with stone bed and explicit frescoes showing available services. The archaeological preservation allowing unprecedented understanding of daily operations in ancient sex industry. The building's location wasn't hidden in shameful alley, but positioned on busy street near theaters and baths. The accessibility reflecting Roman attitude that sex work was normal urban service, like any other commercial transaction, requiring no more moral anguish than visiting baker or cobbler. The architecture was practical rather than luxurious. Small rooms approximately 6 feet by 7 feet, containing stone sleeping platforms with thin mattresses. Minimal decoration beyond service advertisement frescoes, designed for efficiency and volume rather than comfort or romance. The cramped spaces accommodating brief transactions before next customer arrived. The stone beds seem uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, but were practical choice for high-traffic environment, easily cleaned between customers, resistant to body fluids and wear, more sanitary than wooden furniture would have been. The utilitarian design reflecting business priorities of maximum efficiency and minimal maintenance. Above each doorway hung small paintings showing specific sexual positions and acts available in that room. The explicit advertisements serving practical communication function for customers who might not speak Latin. The visual menu system allowing clear understanding of services and pricing without requiring shared language. These erotic frescoes are remarkably explicit by modern standards, showing various positions and combinations with anatomical accuracy and no apparent shame. The artwork being business advertising rather than pornography in Roman understanding. Functional commercial art serving customer information needs. The women working in lupanars came from various backgrounds, most being slaves owned by the establishment's proprietor or working to pay debts, some being free women fallen on economic hard times. The profession representing survival strategy rather than career choice for vast majority of sex workers. Their names survive in graffiti scratched on lupanar walls: Fortunata, Novelia, Sabina, brief textual traces of women whose actual lives remain largely unknown, their experiences filtered through male written sources and archaeological remains that reveal business operations but obscure personal stories. The typical workday began late morning after evening's previous customers had departed and rooms had been cleaned, the sex workers preparing themselves with available cosmetics and perfumes, putting on clothing or costume appropriate to their advertised specialties, readying for afternoon and evening rush of customers. Prices were remarkably low by Roman economic standards, typically 2 to 8 asses per transaction, roughly equivalent to price of bread loaf or cup of wine, the affordability making services accessible to working-class men who formed primary customer base for street-level brothels like Pompeii's Lupanar. Higher-class establishments existed with more expensive courtesans offering extended companionship, conversation, entertainment beyond purely sexual services, but common lupanars focused on quick transactions, serving volume market of ordinary urban residents seeking brief encounters without elaborate social rituals. The madam or pimp managing establishment handled business operations, collecting fees from customers before directing them to appropriate rooms, maintaining order and security, managing the workers' schedules, and ensuring steady flow of customers throughout operating hours. Security was a necessary concern, brothels keeping enforcers who could handle drunk or violent customers, protecting both workers and property from damage, maintaining atmosphere where transactions could proceed safely and efficiently without disruptions. The customer base was predominantly working class and slave men who couldn't afford marriages or maintain concubines, young men before marriage seeking sexual experience, married men whose wives were unavailable during pregnancy or religious festivals. The clientele representing cross-section of male urban population. Upper-class Roman men typically avoided street lupanars, preferring higher-end courtesans or maintaining slaves for sexual purposes. The social stratification of sex work reflecting broader Roman class distinctions and status consciousness. The actual transactions were brief by necessity, the small rooms and constant customer flow requiring efficiency. Typical encounter lasting perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before worker needed to prepare for next customer. The rapid turnover being economic necessity for profitable operation. Privacy was minimal, thin walls allowing sounds from adjacent rooms to be heard. Customers and workers alike accepting this lack of discretion as normal condition of affordable commercial sex. The communal awareness of ongoing activities being unremarkable feature of ancient urban life. Hygiene practices were limited by ancient standards, workers cleaning themselves with water and perhaps vinegar or wine between customers, using olive oil for lubrication, the available methods being far less effective than modern hygiene but representing best practices of the era. Disease transmission was understood dimly, if at all, Romans having no concept of bacteria or viruses. The spread of infections being accepted hazard of sex work that neither workers nor customers could effectively prevent with available knowledge and technology. The religious and moral attitudes toward prostitution were complex. Romans viewing sex work as degrading profession but necessary social service. The contradiction never fully resolved in Roman thought, leading to simultaneous acceptance and stigmatization of sex workers. Prostitutes were legally and socially marginalized, required to register with authorities, forbidden from wearing respectable women's clothing, barred from certain public spaces and religious ceremonies, the legal restrictions reinforcing their outsider status while acknowledging their economic function. The registration system served tax collection purposes as much as moral regulation. Rome being pragmatic about collecting revenue from activities it officially deprecated. The practical approach to taxation overriding moral concerns about legitimizing vice. Male prostitutes also worked in Roman brothels, serving male customers in culture where same-sex activity between men was common, though subject to complex status rules about active versus passive roles. The male sex work industry paralleling female prostitution in many operational details. The graffiti covering lupanar walls provides remarkable documentary evidence about customers' experiences. Men scratching their names, dates, boasts about performance, complaints about prices, crude poems and drawings, the casual vandalism creating unintentional archive of customer perspectives and attitudes. Some graffiti was written by the sex workers themselves, brief texts asserting their names and personalities, occasional complaints about customers or management, rare glimpses of workers' own voices amid overwhelming documentation from customer perspective. The prices marked on walls show variation based on services and workers. Some rooms commanding premium fees, others offering budget options. The pricing structure reflecting market segmentation even in lowest tier of sex industry. The evening hours brought busiest traffic. Men finishing workday and seeking recreation before heading home, the lupanar becoming social destination as much as sexual outlet, groups of friends, sometimes visiting together, making evenings entertainment a communal male bonding activity. Alcohol consumption often accompanied brothel visits, customers arriving already drunk from taverns, purchasing wine on premises if available. The intoxication facilitating both decision to visit and ability to perform, creating predictable cycle of evening crowd behavior. The workers developed professional techniques for managing customers efficiently, establishing boundaries about what services would and wouldn't be provided, handling payment collection, dealing with difficult personalities, maintaining some degree of control in fundamentally vulnerable position. Repeat customers were valuable for steady income, some men developing preferences for particular workers, returning regularly and possibly paying premium prices for familiar favorites. The repeat business providing relative stability in otherwise unpredictable occupation. The transition from customer to customer required both physical and emotional compartmentalization, workers needing to maintain professional demeanor regardless of previous encounters, managing their own physical discomfort and emotional responses while projecting availability and enthusiasm for next transaction. The children born from sex work represented complicated situation, some workers becoming pregnant despite available contraceptive methods, the resulting children facing uncertain futures, often abandoned or raised in poverty, sometimes following parents into sex trade as economic necessity. The retirement from sex work was rarely planned or comfortable, most workers aging out of profession as physical attractiveness declined, finding themselves without savings or alternative skills, many descending into destitution or moving to even more desperate forms of survival. Some exceptional women managed to save money and purchase their freedom if enslaved, establishing themselves in other trades, occasionally even becoming brothel owners themselves, managing new generation of workers in same profession they'd left. The economic mobility being rare but possible, the legal status of sex workers improved slightly under some emperors who enacted protections against abuse and exploitation, though enforcement was inconsistent and legal rights remained limited. The reforms reflecting occasional official concern about industry's worst excesses. The Christian moral revolution gradually transformed Roman attitudes toward prostitution, early Christian writers condemning sex work as sin rather than accepting it as social necessity. The changing moral framework eventually leading to increased stigmatization and legal restrictions. The Pompeii Lupaner's preservation allows modern visitors to walk through actual rooms where ancient transactions occurred, standing in spaces where nameless women serviced countless customers. The archaeological site making abstract historical discussion uncomfortably concrete and real. The erotic frescoes remain vivid after 2,000 years. Painted bodies still coupling on ancient walls, the explicit images shocking some modern visitors while fascinating others, the artwork serving as direct visual connection to vanished sexual culture. Modern archaeology and scholarship work to recover sex workers' experiences from male-dominated source material, using creative interpretation of graffiti, architectural analysis, and comparative studies to glimpse lives that conventional historical sources largely ignored. The economic analysis reveals sex work as significant urban industry, employing thousands across empire, generating substantial tax revenue, supporting related businesses like taverns and bathhouses, the commercial ecosystem around prostitution being major factor in urban economic life. The comparison with other ancient cultures shows remarkable similarities in how civilizations managed sex work, suggesting universal patterns in how societies balance moral disapproval with practical acceptance, legal restriction with economic exploitation. The feminist debates about prostitution find ancient precedents in Roman discussions about whether sex workers were victims deserving sympathy or willing participants in degrading trade. The arguments changing little over millennia, despite dramatic changes in sexual mores and women's rights. The public health implications, barely considered in ancient times, become clear from modern perspective. The disease transmission in high-volume sexual encounters without effective protection creating public health crisis that Romans could neither understand nor effectively address. The psychological toll on sex workers remains largely undocumented in ancient sources, though modern understanding suggests profound effects from repeated sexual encounters without consent or desire, the emotional damage being unrecognized and unaddressed in culture that viewed workers as mere bodies providing service. The modern sex industry inherits many operational patterns from Roman precedents, the basic economics of supply and demand, tiered market segmentation, tension between legal regulation and social stigma, all echoing ancient patterns despite vast changes in technology and social organization. The archaeological tourism around Pompeii's Lupanar raises ethical questions about appropriate engagement with spaces where actual exploitation occurred. The site being simultaneously valuable educational resource and voyeuristic spectacle of ancient suffering. The academic study of ancient prostitution requires balancing historical accuracy with contemporary sensitivity, avoiding both romanticization that minimizes workers' difficult conditions and moralistic judgment that imposes modern values on ancient practices. The preservation efforts at Pompeii include protecting erotic frescoes from deterioration while managing access by visitors who range from serious scholars to giggling tourists. The site management negotiating complex terrain between educational mission. The documentation of graffiti continues as researchers use new technologies to read faded inscriptions, discovering additional names and messages that expand understanding of who visited Lupanars and what they thought about their experiences. The architectural analysis reveals sophisticated understanding of traffic flow and space utilization. The building's design maximizing capacity while maintaining some organization and efficiency. The practical engineering serving business purposes effectively. The comparative studies with medieval and early modern brothels show both continuities and changes in sex work industry. Some operational patterns persisting across centuries, while others reflecting specific cultural and technological circumstances of different eras. The legacy of Roman prostitution includes both the practical precedents for regulating sex work and the cultural attitudes treating workers as simultaneously necessary and despised. The contradictions remaining unresolved in modern debates about sex industry regulation and workers' rights. The Pompeii Lupanar stands as monument to ancient urban life in all its complexity. The preserved brothel representing not just sex industry, but broader Roman attitudes toward pleasure, commerce, class, and the human body. The small building containing within its walls entire worldview about how society organizes intimate human activities for profit.